Okay, we will go ahead and get started. Well, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I am Jessie. I am part of the marketing team, and we just want to thank you for joining us for our webinar, Navigating the Modern Security Landscape. Allen Jenkins, who is our CISO and VP of Cyber Consulting, will be our presenter today. Before I pass it over to Allen, though, I do have a few housekeeping items that I wanted to cover. First, please feel free to utilize the Q&A feature that it is at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. We'll answer all questions at the end of the session. However, we will be opening a few polls throughout the session, so we would really appreciate you participating in those. And then lastly, this session will be recorded. We will send out a copy of that recording to you all by tomorrow, so please look for that in your inbox. And with that, I will go ahead and hand it over to Allen.
Thanks, Jesse. So to Jesse's point, appreciate everybody joining today. We're going to do a session here. We're going to talk about navigating the modern security landscape. And so the thought process behind putting this together is just that bad things are happening out there. We see a lot of bad things happening in the cyberspace, but they're constantly changing and they're evolving. So we wanted to do a session where we talk about some of the things that we're seeing out there, and talk about some of the ways that we see the ability to protect and defend against some of those threats. To start with, I always like to start with an interesting story. So, and you really can't make this up. This is an attack that probably not a lot of people are aware of, but actually playing the Rhythm Nation video from 1989 by Janet Jackson has now been deemed to cause hard drives to crash. This is not just if you're playing the hard drive on, playing the video on the machine, it's machines around that can actually hear this happen. So there's actually a certain frequency that happens when this is played that causes certain hard drives to lock up and stop functioning, and thus cause the machines that they're running on to stop functioning. This is interesting. It's so interesting, in fact, that the MITRE Corporation, which is the group that assigns CVEs, which are vulnerability scores, have assigned a CVE to this modern security threat. So this is probably not one that a lot of us need to worry about, but it is interesting that something that we never thought could be a threat really is. So that's a little bit around why we wanted to put this together today. So the agenda today is not to talk about Janet Jackson, but it's really we're going to work through this session where I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the modern security attacks and some of the modern security landscape. We're going to talk about a review of some good cybersecurity hygiene components. As Jesse mentioned, we're going to have an open dialogue. So certainly, if you have questions, drop them in the Q&A. We'll field as many of those as we can at the end. We're going to also have a couple of pop-ups where we're going to ask for your input as we're going through the session, just to kind of course correct us, make sure that we're addressing some of the things the way that you'd like for us to. So with that, we're going to dive in. So one of the first things that I always like to talk about is sort of setting the table for what is security. Security is so big, and it just keeps getting bigger, right? We just talked about a music video from 1989 causing a problem in our modern world. So it's a big, big landscape, and there's all kinds of tools and technologies, and a lot of people become very overwhelmed with this. So where do we start? So I always like to think about security through what I've got here on the screen, which is the CIA triad. And what this is C stands for confidentiality, and that's really meant for us to be concerned about, do the right people and only the right people have access to our important data. When we talk about the I in the CIA, we're talking about integrity. And this is really about being able to trust our data. Does our data have integrity? And then the last piece is availability. And that's really meant to say, do we have access to our data? Can we use our data when we want to? So if we think back to the Janet Jackson scenario, that's an availability compromise. Those hard drives are no longer available to be used when they're affected by that threat. So I like to use the CIA triad because I think it helps us when we're trying to think about what kind of threats exist. How will they affect us? Would a threat affect the confidentiality, the integrity, or the availability of our data? We can also use this as we talk about, well, how will we defend our environment? What tools, what processes, what people do we need to defend the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of our data? And oftentimes, if we use that lens, it can help us be more laser focused in our mission, which is to defend our assets. So I'd like to pivot from that to talk about something else that's a bit of a staple in the security world, which is Black Hat. So Black Hat is, for their own marketing, the most technical and relevant global information security event series in the world. This is an event that happens every year. This year was the 25th anniversary of Black Hat, and this is where new technologies, new threats are exposed, and people come together to share in what they're learning and then how to defend against these things. So this year was the 25th anniversary of that. And at Black Hat this year, Chris Krebs, who's the founding director of the government's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which is a mouthful. We'll just call it CISA. He's the founding director of this organization. And so he came to Black Hat and he had 3 questions that he wanted to ask. And I thought these would be interesting for us to pose a little bit today. And so the first one, and this is where Jesse's actually going to give everyone on the call the opportunity to weigh in. So we're going to pop up a question here, but his question was, why is it so bad right now? And the thinking here is, why is the state of cybersecurity so bad right now? And I'd love to hear what people have to say. So we're going to give you about 20 to 30 seconds, I believe, to answer this. And then Jesse's going to give some of the information that we're seeing from this poll.
Yes, and let me put it back up. I think it just took my 30 seconds much more quickly than it should have. So give me one moment and I will open that again for everyone. Okay, let's try 45 seconds instead. I'll do a minute and just I will close it by itself. There we go.
I see it up and running now.
Lovely.
So we're really interested here. What do you think? Why is the culture, the cybersecurity space so bad right now? I'll be interested to see what some of the answers are that we get back on this. Jesse, if you see some popping up in the interim and you want to share them, that'd be great.
Okay, I will give it looks like we are about at 30 seconds, and I see a couple in progress.
Early on in the session, people might not have known that they had to
be alert. We're testing. Oh, we've got some good things coming in. Okay, we're gonna give it the remaining 15 seconds. So feel free to type away, everyone. And then I'll close it in just a few and share the results. Okay, great. Here we go. Let's see.
What's some of the answers?
Okay, some of the things. Knowledge base availability, labor shortage, too many tools to manage and tools not talking to each other, everything being attached to the internet, current state of global affairs, it adding to that. So many moving parts being done digitally opens up many vulnerabilities for attacks.
So those are some great answers, and I wouldn't say that any of them are wrong at all. And a lot of them touch on some of what Chris talked about at Black Hat. And one of the keys that he really drove home was the complexity of the world. And I think one of our answers talked about that, and that touches on that plethora of tools out there. And one of the things that we see so much is a heavy dependence on tools. And I think one of the things that Chris said was that we've almost turned like complexity into a fetish. And I see that a lot when I talk to customers where we've designed, and I'm using the collective we've designed systems that are very complex with lots of moving pieces and lots of technology, but sometimes that can be a detriment to what we're trying to do. So going back to the basics can actually be a good thing and stripping some of that complexity out. So great answer. So if you didn't already read ahead, there's going to be two more questions. So the next one that Chris shared was, what do you mean it's going to get worse? So we're going to ask you the same thing. Why do you think the state of cybersecurity is going to get worse before it gets better? And again, we'll give you a minute to answer this, and we'd love to hear what you all have to say, and then we'll compare that with what Chris had to say as well.
See a couple coming in, so that's good. We've got about 30 more seconds.
Awesome. We probably should have peppered these throughout presentation.
Nope, just hit them all at once. This is good. We've got participation, so that's fair. Okay, just about done. We've got a couple coming in. All right, 5 more seconds. Click submit, and we're done.
So what are we hearing, Jesse?
Okay, let me see. We've got budgets for security innovation will be reduced. Not enough expertise on staff to manage an event, even with a load of tools for that. Evolving threats on a daily basis.
Those are really good. I'm wondering, some people on this call may have actually been at Black Hat and heard this talk, so we may need to disqualify some of those answers, but they're really, really good answers. And they all touch on some of the important issues that we see. One of the keys that I think Chris touched on, and I think somebody did in their answer, is that we also have a little bit of a budget crunch. So defending costs some money. Cybersecurity can sometimes not be inexpensive, and specifically when we look at the people, process, and technology components. And so one of the things that Chris saw as a real issue, and we see it day to day as we work with people, is that sometimes security falls to the bottom of the stack as far as where are we going to spend our time, our money, our resources. And until we're able to change that narrative and look at security more as a strategic solution, we're going to continue to have some problems. These problems aren't going to go away. The bad guys aren't going to go away. We've got to maybe change how we position security within our enterprise. One last question, and this I think was sort of a great wrapper, was what are we going to do about this? So we know that it's bad. We expect that it may get a little bit worse. What are we going to do about it? So we're going to pop that up, give everybody a chance to weigh in. Really, this is a really good one for us to learn from what the collective thoughts are out there. I see security as a team sport. I learn something in every discussion I have with folks. I'm really excited to hear what you guys have to say about this.
30 more seconds, and this is the last one. So don't worry, guys. It's like a test. What is it? I mean, it was the first day of school for a lot of people this week, so why not be in the spirit?
But we do have one more later in the session, right, Jeff?
Yes, but that's a quick, yes or no. So not to put hopefully too much thought into it.
Heavy thing for that one.
All right, just about done. A couple more seconds. And there we go. Okay, let's see. Okay. Simplify the approach, consolidate tools, leverage the entire workforce and enhance security culture, be more like Allen Jenkins, stay on top of your knowledge of threats and communicate with each other.
Well, I love the be more like me, but I don't know if that's really going to help you out. So some really, really good answers in there. I think that the simplify was certainly a theme throughout Chris's discussion. Another theme was really to educate and engage, and that was really one of his focuses, was to continue, even though a lot of people feel like security education is overwhelming or security education may not be effective, we've got to find a way for it to be effective. And we've got to use that education to engage the business and engage organizations so that we can move security into a strategic discussion and make it more effective. So one, thanks everybody for playing. I promise we're not going to make you do question after question, but it's really good to hear your thoughts as we move down the road. And it's really helpful for others to hear those thoughts too. So thanks very much. What we'll do though is we'll move ahead. And so now that we've heard a little bit about, one, we saw the crazy thing with Janet Jackson. We've heard a little bit about, what the state of cybersecurity is. Let's talk about some very specific things. So some prevalent modern threats and trends. And so the first thing, what keeps up business leaders and insurance companies at night? Well, ransomware for sure. Now there's probably other things, but in this talk, ransomware is key. And honestly, this is one of the things that I and my team spend a ton of time focusing on, both when bad things happen, but more importantly, we'd like to talk to people before bad things happen. So got a couple of slides here I want to talk about. So one of the keys that we've discovered is getting people to think about ransomware through the lens of a disaster. And a lot of the events my team has participated in incident response and incident management have been that exactly, where we've needed to fall back on an organization's disaster recovery plan to actually recover the organization. But it's more than that, because we've got to pepper throughout that good security practices to make sure that we're restoring in a safe and secure way, and we're not overwriting important data that we might need to use for investigation purposes. What I want to point out is that these are big events, and in risk management theory, there's a couple of key metrics that you use to assess risk. One is likelihood, and that's what this top number on this slide is all about. So the concept of thinking that a bad thing won't happen to me, a ransomware event won't happen to me. This is data from a poll from IBM, where the organizations that were polled, over 50% of those organizations had been breached. So that makes me feel like likelihood is high. And I see this in the discussions I have with people every day. It's no longer do we talk to people and say, talk about ransomware and it's mysterious. A lot of people say, yeah, we've already been affected by this. So the likelihood is pretty high. The other risk assessment component or risk management component is impact. So if a bad thing happens, how will it affect me? And the bottom line is always really important. The bottom number that we've got here is from a Forrester poll, where the average cost of a data breach in the US was almost $4 million. And trending year over year, both of these numbers are going up. So the likelihood is getting higher and the impact is costing us more. So this is an important thing to consider, and it's a business, it's a strategic concern, because when one of these events happens, it's the business, it's the organization that can't function properly anymore. So it's not just a technology problem. So what I wanted to do was talk about a very specific ransomware variant. This is about the Hive ransomware variant. This is a relatively new variant, but it's quickly become the fourth most prevalent strain that's affecting organizations today. It started about 100 to 200 days ago, and on average, 3 companies per day are being affected by the Hive ransomware. Now, it's operated as ransomware as a service. And if you don't know what that means, what that really means is that there are actually business functions where I can go and essentially rent a ransomware strain like Hive and use it to do my bidding. So I don't have to be a smart hacker. I don't have to write code. I can actually go and rent this software from these people, pay them for the use of it, and then extort money from others using it. So this is a multiplier effect. On top of that, we also know that it's focused right now on the energy sector, on healthcare and financial organizations. But what we've seen in the past is organizations like Hive, who are being very effective, they're going to continue to spread their wings. They're going to continue to try to affect other organizations as well. So if you don't fall into one of those 3, don't feel super comfortable. You could still be a target for them. I want to talk a little bit about how Hive works, because it's fairly representative of how a lot of these ransomware types of events work. And this gets a little technical, but what I'm drawing here, what I'm showing is the area where I've circled. this is how Hive starts. So what happens is the proxy shell is a vulnerability. It's a well-known vulnerability with Exchange servers. So Exchange servers are used to send email. And there's been a lot of move to move email services to the cloud, but there's still an awful lot of on-premise Exchange servers out there in the world. And about a year to a year and a half ago, this proxy shell vulnerability was exposed. So it's well known, and it allows for bad actors to attach to these things and get into the Exchange server and start to move into your network. So a plethora of bad things can happen with that. An easy way or easier way to affect this is to migrate your Exchange system, or there's some patches, there's some other defensive things you can do to protect. But if those things aren't in place, this is how the Hive folks get into your network. Once that happens, then they establish what's called a command and control, or you might have heard called a C2 session, which is essentially where they open a network connection back out to their headquarters, to their operations center. Because they've gotten in, they want to make sure they can get back out. And they'll use tools like Cobalt Strike to establish those sessions. Then what they'll do is they'll start to move into your network. And they will use a variety of tools. This is representative of some of the tools and some of the methods that Hive specifically uses. So they may use tools that are already in your network. So some common tools that are part of a Windows network are things like PSExec and WMI. They will use these tools to do what's called living off the land. So they can use these tools to move throughout your environment, and it looks like it's a normal operation, but they're using the tools to gather information about your environment. Where's your data? Where are your accounts? They can also start to use some other tools that they may have dropped into your environment, like PC Hunter, like Kill AV. They can use these tools to start to harvest information, to actually shut down some of the defensive services in your environment, like turning off your antivirus services, like turning off volume shadow copy services. So they start to, one, gather information, but then they also start to soften the landscape of your security platform, so it's easier for them to move without being seen. And then finally, what they do is they'll use things like 7-zip, which is, again, a common tool that we use to zip up files, to compress files. They'll use a tool like that to compress all the important data that they found that they want. Then they'll use tools like MegaSync or others to synchronize those files off of your network. So now they're taking your data. And then finally, they'll encrypt the system so that you can't use them anymore. This is where we get into that availability compromise. And the last thing they do is they drop a ransom note on your screen. And this is a Hive ransom note. And I think there's a couple of key things that I want you to take from this. One is they call out that they've decrypted all your data, right? So they're telling you what they've done. What I really like is in line 4 there, where they tell you that if you want to, you can contact their sales department. So the Hive ransomware folks have a sales department. They give you, and I love this in 7 and 8, they give you a secure mechanism, a login and a password for you to contact their sales department so that you can purchase from them software that will make your data available to you again. Then they walk through some technical do's and don'ts. And finally, at the very end in line 18, they give you a little bit of a scare factor. So if you don't do the things that we're asking you to do, then we may publicly disclose your data. This is kind of what's called a double extortion. So one, they've taken your data and made it unavailable to you, but they may also expose your data publicly. This is very common in a lot of ransomware, and this is what happens. So this is a modern threat that is super prevalent, and Hive is just representative of how they work. So that's one that we already know a lot about, and it's really, really painful. Let's talk about something that's maybe a little more modern or a little more cutting edge. So 2 things I'm going to call out here are called MFA fatigue and smishing. And you may have heard of each of these. MFA fatigue, multi-factor authentication, is where we use more than one item to authenticate a user. So I've got my ID, my Allen Jenkins ID, then I've got a password. That's a single factor. With multi-factor, I add at least an additional factor. So that could be using an app on my phone. It could be a number of different things. So what we're seeing now is this concept of MFA fatigue. And what happens in an MFA fatigue attack is a threat actor discovers a way and infiltrates your MFA network such that they can send requests over and over and over for you to say yes to from an MFA standpoint. The fatigue aspect is that they know just human issues, people will ultimately say okay and just click okay. And once they do that, they've allowed the bad actors in. And I'm going to show you how that works a little bit. Smishing, we'll talk about after we talk through the MFA fatigue. So with MFA fatigue, the best example for me to show is Cisco hack. So Cisco, this isn't anything that most people don't already know. Cisco is a major networking and security vendor in the world. We work with them. We know that they had a hack just a brief while back. We know that because Talos, which is their security arm, published in-depth information about what happened. One, to be helpful to the security environment, and then two, as a disclosure event to say, look, we had an issue. Nothing really of importance was taken, so that's good. So there's a couple of key things that happened with the Cisco hack. One was that a personal Gmail credential was compromised. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but the personal Gmail was used versus the professional or the corporate network email. Passwords were stored in the browser. Also, the MFA, which had been put in place to secure the data, was actually fatigued or leveraged to get through by using MFA fatigue to ultimately gain acceptance to the network. And then once in, they used tools to harvest more information, and they created the VPN access. So once they were in, they created additional accounts that gave them access into the network. So let's talk a little bit about each one of those things and what we might do about it. So the first thing, so lesson learned, a possible lesson learned was they used a personal email account to get in. So what a lot of people don't realize is that your personal emails can tie back to your corporate environment. You may be logging on using your corporate device to your personal Gmail or your personal email account and checking things. If you're on a corporate device, you could be making yourself vulnerable. So a lot of times people don't realize that, and they don't take the same due diligence with things like their passwords and their password, their accounts. So it's a good idea to use very strong passwords and strong credentials and things like multi-factor authentication, even with your personal accounts. And if you want some guidance on that, what I popped up on the screen here is NIST Special Publication 863B, which goes over some very specific information about what you should do and how you should create and manage passwords and credentials. That's one thing. If that user's personal Gmail had been hardened a little bit, they might not have had the issue they had. The other thing is to realize that there is a sort of a connective tissue between our personal and professional world. So if you're using, for example, what I've shown on screen here, if we're using Google Chrome as our browser, you can turn on this feature, which is really handy, called Sync. What that does is if I set favorites on my desktop in Google Chrome, and then I go to use Chrome on my phone, those same favorites will be there. So my settings and whatnot will follow me. Well, that's interesting and good, but you have to be aware of that, because if I do something on my phone, that same setting in my browser may follow me into my corporate world and again expose my corporate environment. One of the other easy features using things like our browsers, in this case, I'm showing Chrome, is I can allow the browser to store my passwords. So if I don't want to have to type in my Amazon password and my Netflix password and all the different passwords and credentials that I use, I can have my browser collect those. The problem with that is that then that gets stored in my Chrome. If I've turned on Sync, that gets moved to all the places where I have my Google Chrome browser connection. So if somebody hacks my Google account and I've stored my passwords in my browser, they can now get access to all the other passwords that I've stored in the browser. So that's a no-no, honestly. It's a challenge. I know that we all like to do that, but it can very much turn into a bad thing. And then finally, just deploying something like multi-factor authentication is not enough. We're all getting bombarded with questionnaires from our partners, from insurance, and one of the silver bullets is to deploy multi-factor authentication. It is a great technology However, just turning it on isn't enough. So we need to be able to go in and train our users. So one, not to click OK if they're getting bombarded with requests. But we also need to tune the tools. And some of the tools are just now reaching maturity level where we can do things where we can tune them and configure them such that if we see a barrage of multi-factor requests, we can lock that account. So that we've got to do some more due diligence. So just deploying the tools and the technology are not enough. So let me pivot really quickly over to smishing. So smishing is phishing. So a lot of people know what phishing is. Phishing is typically where we use email to deliver interesting links or bad code that can cause bad things to happen. Well, a lot of people are aware of that. We're getting better at educating people about that. But what the bad guys have learned is that, well, let's use texting to deliver these things as well. So some of the reasons is almost everybody carries a smartphone. So it's a huge and popular audience for the bad guys. Research has also shown that while we may be able to leave emails piling up in our box and not opening them, we can't do that with text messages. The average is that we open 98% of the things that pop up in our text messages. So bad guys know that. So why not use that and understand that you're probably going to open it. Also, there are tools out there that can automate the sending of these messages. So they can send thousands of these things out all at one point. So again, if I shotgun approach, the likelihood of at least a handful of these paying dividends is good. And finally, in contrast to emails, so there's a lot of interesting tools and good technologies that we can use to try to block or flag suspicious emails. That's harder to do with text messages. Some of the technology just needs to catch up a little bit with that. And to be honest, we're still fighting that a little bit with email as well. So it's a hard thing to defend against. So all those things make this very, very attractive for the threat actors to utilize this to do. So what's an example of this? So what I'm showing here is a typical example, which is saying, hi, James, your FedEx package with this code is waiting, and then there's a link. And do you need to click on this to set the delivery preferences? So we're all kind of inclined now, especially over the last couple of years. We're doing a lot more shopping. We're having food delivered to our homes. So we're inclined to click on these things because we want to make sure that our things arrive. They arrive on time. They arrive appropriately. So this is a very, very common sort of attack vector. What they may ask is what's the challenge. So let's talk about some impacts and questions to ask. So some impacts is a lot of the times what these people are asking for is credit card information, or they may ask for personal information. The more personal information they can get, the more they can use. So address, phone number, social security number, gathering account information. Could you verify your ID for us is a common one. Could you reset your password for us is another. Oftentimes when you do that, you're just feeding that information to the bad guys. And then especially during COVID, we've seen a lot of questions about health information. So we need to harvest when you had your last shots or when you last visited the doctor or what are the medicines you're taking. All this might seem innocuous, and we're all kind of conditioned at this stage to want to be helpful, but these can turn into bad things if we answer these questions. So some common questions to ask is around the notification of delivery specifically. Did you even set up text notifications? If you didn't, then this is a fraudulent thing. Did you send the package or were you expecting a delivery? A lot of the times we're not, so there's absolutely no reason. And then I think the last question, actually, I thought I had another question. One of the questions that maybe I erased out of here, but I still like to ask it, is, does this just seem normal? And that's a blanket statement that I use with a lot of the emails that I see, a lot of the text messages, but is something weird about this? If you get that odd feeling, a lot of the times follow that feeling. And just like phishing, with smishing, report it. You can report it to your corporate support people. You can also talk to your phone carriers. And there are sometimes ways that they can track and block and provide assistance in dealing with this. So finally, I want to talk about a future security concern. And this is one that was just exposed recently called the invisible finger. And so what I'm going to do is posed this one. I want to make it aware that this is called out as one of the scariest things at Black Hat 2022. We talked about Black Hat earlier. It's a huge and very well respected security conference each year. This is the 25th anniversary, and this is one of the scariest things that was seen there. So here's the scenario. You walk into a meeting with your mobile device, and it could be a tablet, could be your phone, a touch screen is required. You set that down face down. Now, people are conditioned to do this a lot of the time because they're using it. They don't want people to see the different things that are popping up on their screen, so they just set it face down. It's fairly common. Then an invisible finger taps your screen and installs malware, or it can send a payment using PayPal. And you're going, well, how does that work? That doesn't make sense to me. So this is how it works. So the group that has worked on this, they're manipulating electromagnetic fields. We've got a typo there. That should be EMF, not EMC. But they're manipulating the fields that actually make our touch screens work. And this is according to the white paper that the group who has been working on this put. So I didn't make this up. They're using some sophisticated science, so they're not exactly going to divulge all of that. But it also requires the use of strategically placing some antenna arrays. So if you look here, what we're basically saying is by putting some antennas, possibly in like conference rooms, meeting rooms, maybe where executives might be ahead of time, and scheduling that and looking for that opportune moment when maybe somebody comes and sets their phone down. So this is interesting. So how do we defend that sort of thing? And we're not going to ask that question right now. What I do want to know, though, is, Jesse, and this might be a great time if you could pop on the screen. What I'd love to know is your phone face up or face down right now? And we'll give it 30 seconds, I think, to see what the majority of people say on that.
Yes, we've got about 15 seconds remaining.
All right.
Like we said, this was a quick one. This is an easy yes or no.
We didn't have to do a lot of deep thought on this one. And I did make Jesse answer this question before we started. So,
and it was different from the first time that we talked about this. All right.
So what
here, I can actually share them. Can you see those?
Yeah.
Majority is up.
So the majority is up. Yes. Okay. Okay. So face up. All right. Well, that's a good thing. So I'm going to clear that off. And how to defend this? It's pretty simple. Set your phone face up. So the majority of you are in a good place. So the way that this technology works right now, as long as your phone's face up, it can't be attacked. Now, this seems a little far-fetched. The likelihood of this happening is pretty thin right now. The reason I call it out is that there are people out there coming up with new and interesting ways to affect the technology that we use every day. And so while this looks kind of kludgy right now, give it a few years. And I bet having the phone face up or face down won't matter. I bet the software will get a lot easier to use. I get the antenna will probably be more of a wireless networking kind of thing. So this is a little future casting, but these are the kind of things that we need to think about, maybe a little down the road, but we need to be pondering them. So we're going to talk a little bit about some back to basics approaches, back to what Chris Krebs said, and I see this all the time. A lot of times the basics get missed. We get really interested in complexity and tools. So we're going to talk a little bit about some other ways to address this. So we're going to talk about some cyber hygiene. We're going to talk about the cyber defense matrix and the cybersecurity framework. And finally, I'll talk about our offering, ransomware protection as a service. So quickly, I'm going to build some of these out. So some cyber hygiene items just to be aware of. And these are key. One is understanding how the business uses technology. Now that sounds trite, but a lot of the times we don't have that clearly defined. So having clearly articulated and understood policies, standards, guidelines within our environment, what can I do, what shouldn't I do? Having business impact assessments, understanding what the impact would be to us as an organization if a piece of technology were affected and how it was affected. Remember CIA, What happens if the integrity of my data is impacted versus what happens if the availability is impacted? Using those sorts of thought processes to then build out our incident response plans and our disaster recovery plans, and then testing those things and making sure that they work. Really, really important. We also have to care about people. So we have to really care about people and how trained up and aware they are about security practices. But we also have to care about how we manage their identity and then their authentication and access. So do they have more access than they should have? And are we applying good authentication practices for them? Some other hygiene items, infrastructure. So we absolutely need to care about the perimeter, the outside layer of our network. But we also have to realize that that may have extended out to the cloud. We may have to think about the cloud perimeter and our perimeter, and how do we share data securely between the two. So an important consideration is a secure network design. And then we've got to do things like vulnerability management. So just like that Exchange server that I mentioned earlier with the vulnerability, we need to know about the vulnerabilities in our environment. We've got to have plans for how we're going to mitigate the risk that they pose to our environment. We've got to think about data. Data is really what matters. One of my friends who's the CISO at a really large university did a talk, and he talked about how he doesn't really care if a device is impacted. He cares about data being impacted. So I like that thought process. So let's think about how we handle data. How do we encrypt it? When should we encrypt it? How do we handle email? How do we make sure that our email is handled securely? Are we backing up? And even more importantly, can we recover our data? And then finally, do we understand what compliance requirements we may have? If we're handling credit card data, if we're handling healthcare data, there are different rules and different things that we need to do to make sure that it's secure. Devices are important primarily because they're a gateway to the data. So we need to think about how can we harden those devices. And what I mean by that is a lot of times if we take a workstation out of the box from Dell or HP or whomever we purchase from, there's a bunch of software on that thing. Most of that we don't need. And a lot of that could be fraught with vulnerabilities. So we want to think about how do we harden the gateways to our data. And then also what endpoint tools do we put on those devices? So how can we make sure that, for example, antivirus tools are on and are effective, and even more modern endpoint devices like EDR tool sets, which help us to detect and recover anomalous behavior. And then just like the phone item that we shared with the invisible finger, we're providing access to our data more and more with our mobile devices as the gateway. So we need to think about how we deal with those. And we need to think about monitoring. So we need to understand what's normal and what's not normal in our environment. So some common tools for that are things like SIEM tools, which is a security incident and event management platform, which would allow us to ingest log data from various components within our network and understand what's normal, what normally happens on these devices and what's not normal, so that we can react accordingly. And then manage detection and response and endpoint detection and response. I want to point out that a lot of these are not just a technology. These are about a technology possibly, but it can also be a people thing. So if we've even got the tools deployed, do we have people who are trained and watching the tools all the time? And that's going to bleed over into the discussion here. So what you'll see on the background here is our NIST cybersecurity framework. So the identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. We're coaching ourselves to be more diligent in following standards, and we're absolutely coaching our customers. The reason being is we don't want to make it up on our own. There are standards out there that have been developed by industry experts. So adopting them and following them and realizing that we may not measure up well against these now, but we can grow and get better and better following these. So we've established the NIST cybersecurity framework as one of our standards. And just a quick logical is to think about following this from left to right. So the first thing I need to know about my security program is I've got to identify what's important in my environment. Then I work to the right. So once I identify a critical asset like a server, and I understand what is on the server, then I can determine how I want to protect that server. And depending on what data is on that server, it may be different. I may have a server that doesn't have any critical data, and then I may have a server that's got mission critical data. Should I put the same level of due diligence and the same level of effort into protecting both of those assets? Maybe, maybe not. And then we continue to work through the cybersecurity framework to make sure that we also can early detect, respond, and recover. So along with that, we've also added to our methodology this concept of the cyber defense matrix. And this was developed by the senior security scientist at a large financial organization. And been researching this and leveraging this as well. And what it does is it adds the items down to the left-hand side of the slide here first. So it breaks up the identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover into even smaller functions. And it says maybe we should look at how we identify devices. Maybe we should look at how we identify applications. So we get a little more specific and break out specifics about how we deal with each layer within our environment. This can also be a good way to catalog, do we have people, do we have process, and do we have technology in each one of these buckets to deal with this thing? So if I build this out and put all of my tools, all of my processes, and all of my people, then I can easily look and go, well, I've got a gap. Maybe I've got a gap in respond and network. So that's an area where I can improve. And then the other component that got added with the cyber defense matrix is the bottom piece around the degree of dependency. And I've been talking a little bit about people, process, and technology. All three are super important. In the cyber defense matrix, the thought process is that we're heavier on process on the identify side, and we get more and more dependent on, well, actually, we're heavy on process the whole way through. Sorry, we're heavier on technology on the identify side, and as we move to the right with recovery, we become less dependent on technology and more dependent on people. Now, that might not be the exact mix in your environment, but it's an important thing to consider is where am I strong, where am I weak, but also where are my dependencies, because that can help you plan as well. Another important component with this that gets added in is this concept of left and right of boom. And here we've called it pre-event awareness and post-event awareness, but really the concept is that everything identify and protect is about proactive. It's left of boom, meaning a bad thing. So we're going to do most of our identify and protect before something bad happens. These are proactive activities. Everything on the right side or right of boom are things that happen after a bad thing happens. I don't really detect an anomalous thing unless it's a bad thing. So that's going to happen right of boom. So we also are starting to use this to start to consider, well, where are we strong? Are we strongest in the left of boom area? Maybe we need to spend more time focusing on our ability to detect, respond, and recover. So some different ways of pulling apart our security program and measuring and then developing it for the future. Finally, and I'm going to build this out quickly, but finally, we at InterVision have dealt with a lot of ransomware. And so one of the things that we've built out is a solution that encompasses people, process, and technology. We're calling our solution RPAS for Ransomware Protection as a Service. And the idea here is that we want to touch across all of the stack in this cybersecurity framework. And we want to provide guidance, advice, people, process, and technology to help people be prepared and ideally thwart any bad activity around ransomware, but also be able to rapidly respond should something happen. And the way for us to do that is we built out a SOC as a service, or Security Operations Center as a service component, where we get in, we identify your environment, and then we put in some tools that will help us to protect and detect, but also feeds data back to our 24/7, 365 Security Operations Center with people who can analyze and respond rapidly. So if something bad does get into our environment, we can contain it quickly. If something bad gets in, and let's say we have a server perhaps that gets ransomware, what we want to have happen is we want to stop it before that goes onto another server and another server and another server, which is great. We've done early containment, that's awesome. But we also realize that we still have to recover that single server. So that's where we move to that next level, which is our recovery as a service. So we've got a whole team of disaster recovery experts who focus on backup and recovery technologies and disaster recovery scenarios. So that team would work to help understand where the critical data lies, understand what recovery time objectives, recovery point objectives you have, and then build out a solution where we move your data to a protected location so that the bad guys can't get to it, and also give a landing zone so we can spin that environment up rapidly if need be. But we don't spin it back up on the affected device, again, if we're talking about that affected server, because if we do, we could be wiping out evidence for a forensic investigation. So we may need to leave that intact. And finally, we wrap around this entire platform what we call our virtual CISO service. This is where we provide a dedicated resource who's a senior security advisor to work with our customer to understand their environment, to understand all those things that we talk about in hygiene, maybe to help them measure their environment against the cybersecurity framework, and maybe adopt things like the defense matrix to help them continue to evolve their environment. Also to work with the SOC team and the recovery team to validate that the data that we see is good and make sure that we can recover. So we do things like tabletop exercises and disaster recovery exercises to validate that what we put in place works. And in the instance that we do have to go to that disaster scenario, that virtual CISO will also act as an incident manager to help the customer through that situation. So, some closing, a quick recap, and you all have been very, very patient. We've had a lot of information thrown out there today. So closing items, the defense is super important. This is not a technology problem. It's not going away. We need to deal with it, and we need to raise up the awareness. New techniques are constantly being developed. We showed some today, some that are, maybe outside the norm, but I show those because I think they tell us about that we need to think outside of the box. The hygiene is often overlooked. Doing the basics. In a football analogy, you got to learn to block and tackle, right? So it's fun to score the touchdowns, but we got to do the blocking and tackling to make that happen. And finally, you don't have to do this alone. So there's standards out there like the NIST standards that you can go and download and adopt. And then there's people like us at InterVision. This is what we do every day. So we work through this with different organizations and help them to better secure their environments, better be prepared. And finally, you have to be careful listening to Janet Jackson. So with that, I think we may have a few minutes left. Jess, I'm going to ask if you have any Q&A out there or anything that we can address for anybody.
We have a couple, and just a reminder, guys, please feel free to use that Q&A section if you want to submit any questions before we wrap up. There were just a couple of kind of overarching questions. I'll kind of read them. I'll let you tackle them as you'd like, Alan, but kind of asking, there's so much to consider. Where do we start? What's the best first step for protecting, our organizations? Or on the flip side of that, how do we react? When we think we have an incident, what's the first step there?
Let's jump on both of those because they're both really important. So where do we start? And that's part of this is security can be very overwhelming, right? But one of the first things that I usually recommend to people is to do some level of assessment. So understand your environment. If we looked at the cybersecurity framework, go back to that identify phase and spend some time discovering your environment and understanding where is the gold, where is the most important stuff that makes our business tick, and how am I best able to defend that? And then if you've done a little bit of that, you may even want to stand that up and measure it against a standard like the cybersecurity framework or something of that nature, and start to build a roadmap for how to improve. Security is kind of never ending, right? So we can't stop and go, we're good because we have to constantly evolve. So I think that's a great first step. And certainly those are things that we do. So we help people with a lot of security assessments and discovery workshops. So we're happy to help in that vein as well. And I think the second question was around what if something bad does happen? What do we do? So we can certainly help with incident response. So we do incident response and help people. One of the very first calls that you need to make, though, you certainly can contact us. But one of the first things that we always have to do, whether we're engaged or not, is we need to talk to our insurance carriers. So I mentioned earlier, Insurance is providing all these great surveys that everybody has to answer now about what you're doing in your environment. There's a reason for that. Insurance has taken a big hit over the last few years, being involved in either paying ransom or paying for the recovery after ransom type of events. So they've had to up their game and their due diligence. Inclusive of that is they need to be a part of your recovery process. They need to really help you define how you will respond. Oftentimes, they have vetted and have partnerships with forensics companies and legal firms that they may engage on your behalf to bring in. So one of the first calls should be to your legal folks, and certainly we're here to help as well. Other questions?
We did have one of our, oh, well, here's one other that just came in. What are some of the most common security gaps that are usually identified in organizations?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's really hard to say there's a common because everybody's a little different. But I will say one of the common trends that we're starting to really look at for organizations is around account management. And that might not seem sexy or what you were expecting me to say, but what we're finding is privileged accounts, which is the folks who have elevated privileges like administrator accounts, root level access. They are the things that the bad guys want, right? So if they get access to that level of account, that they can get access to everything. So oftentimes those aren't managed well within an environment. So too many people have that access, or that access isn't managed well. When's the last time the password was changed, for example? Making sure that all those accounts are using things like multi-factor, as well as service accounts. So service accounts can be a backdoor into environments for things like services that are running like backup services and whatnot that may also have elevated privileges. This also is a thing that the threat actors really want to get hold of. So we're seeing a definite trend from people like insurance, and it's also something that we're looking at more and more, is how are you handling account management? That's becoming super critical to consider.
And one more quick one, and then we'll wrap up. What is your recommendation for the best password or credential manager?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I typically will steer clear of product recommendations because I can guarantee you if I tell you right now, use product A, by the end of the day, that company's going to get hacked, and then you're going to come back and tell me that job for you. What I do tell people is to do your due diligence, understand what you want the tool to do. Are you comfortable with your data being in the cloud? Do you want it stored locally? What use cases? How many people? Or is it just you? So think about how you're going to use the tool. Do some due diligence, do some research to find out how does that organization handle security of your data because you're giving them your data, and reach a place where you're comfortable. And then if you still have questions, then reach out to others in the security field who you can talk to and just hey, I'm thinking about using this tool. Do you know anything good or bad about it? That's kind of a tough question to ask. There's a lot of different tools out there, and they're constantly sort of leapfrogging each other. So I try to steer clear of saying this is the best tool right now because it'll change pretty quickly.
Fair enough. Okay, well, that's it. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thanks, Alan. That was great insight. So, reminder that we are recording this session, and we will be sure to get a copy to everyone. But thanks for joining us, and have a great day.
Thank you.